Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. Before we fade into the past, let me ask, have you ever wondered how 200 people could survive months at minus 20 degrees Celsius with only one central fire and the quiet heat of their own bodies? Each person radiating roughly 100 watts together, producing the warmth of a small furnace inside walls of stone that remembered summer's heat from 40 feet below ground. No Hollywood hearths blazing in every room. Just raw, ingenious partnership with earth and stone. A single oversight could mean death by morning. Some winters claimed lives. Others left survivors forever changed. These were the true winter survival skills of medieval times, silent adaptations that shaped medieval life far beyond what most medieval documentaries show. This isn't a story of comfort. It's the deeper truth of how castles became living things, breathing, drinking, human breath for water, holding warmth like ancient memory. If this quiet exploration speaks to you, a like would mean a lot. For more evenings like this, subscribe and perhaps share. Where you're listening from tonight, what time it is where you are. These stories still connect us across centuries. Now settle in, dim the lights, pull the blanket close, let your room's warmth gently recede. The year is 1430. The coldest decade of the 15th century grips England in an icy fist. We're entering a castle not as guests, but as witnesses to a survival system so sophisticated it outwitted its own builders. Where stone didn't wait for human heat, stone gave heat back. Where life didn't conquer winter, it breathed alongside it. Ready? Then let us begin. The wind arrives first, not as sound, but as pressure, a slow, vast exhalation from the north that has traveled across frozen seas and empty moorlands. By the time it reaches the castle, it carries the breath of Greenland glaciers, the memory of pack ice grinding against stone coasts. It doesn't howl, not yet. Instead, it presses against the outer walls with patient, terrible weight, like something testing for weakness. Stand at the base of the castle's south tower on this December evening, and you'll feel the temperature dropping as the sun, what little sun there was, slides below the horizon. Not the gentle cooling of modern winters, but a plunge so swift you can almost hear it, the air contracting, condensing, becoming something thicker than atmosphere, colder than breath. Within an hour, exposed skin would begin to crystallize. Within 3, you'd lose sensation in your extremities. By dawn, if you remained outside, you'd be part of the landscape. The snow has stopped, but it has remade the castle. Battlements are capped in deep, white, narrow windows, choked with drifts. The courtyard, once mud and motion, lies smooth and silent under a blanket that swallows all sound. But look closer at the stone. The castle walls, built from limestone quarried from nearby hills, have taken on a peculiar quality in this cold. During warmer months, they're grey, sturdy, unremarkable, functional. Now in the depths of winter, they've darkened to something closer to charcoal, as if the stone itself is conserving light, pulling it inward. Where snow touches the walls, it doesn't melt. It adheres, bonding to the porous surface through some molecular conspiracy between water and calcium carbonate. The castle is becoming its environment, growing a second skin of ice and compressed snow that will remain until March. This is when you begin to understand the castle isn't a building in the traditional sense. It's a collaboration between human intention and geological patience. These walls, some of them 12 feet thick at the base, aren't just barriers against enemies. They're participants in an exchange so subtle it took generations to recognize. The wind shifts. Now it does begin to howl a low note that vibrates through the gatehouse and spirals up the stairwell towers. Inside the thickness of the walls in passages, only rats and spiders know air moves, according to laws the builders couldn't name but somehow understood. Cold air heavier than warm sinks through invisible channels. It pools in the lowest cellars 40 feet beneath the courtyard, where it meets something unexpected. Warmth. Not the flickering, temporary warmth of fires, those will come later, but the steady, ancient warmth of the earth itself. Below the frost line, beneath the reach of even this savage winter, the temperature remains constant. 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, sustained by the slow decay of radioactive elements in the planet's mantle and the residual heat from Earth's formation 4 billion years ago. The castle's deepest cellars tap into this reservoir without ceremony or understanding. They simply exist in that space where cold from above meets warmth from below, creating a layer of tolerable air that rises gradually through the structure's bones. The castle is beginning to breathe. Watch the battlements now as full darkness settles. From certain angles you might catch something strange, a shimmer of warmer air rising from ventilation shafts that pierce through inner walls to outer ramparts. Medieval engineers working from intuition and bitter experience created a system of interconnected airways that allows the castle to exhale the worst of its own moisture, the breath of 200 people, the steam from kitchens, the exhalations of animals stabled below. Without this passive respiration, the interior would become a death trap of mold and lung fever within weeks. But we're still outside in the killing cold. Let's delay our entry a moment longer. There's something important you need to see here in the threshold space between the world of winter and the world of stone. At the main gate, snow has been cleared away. Not easily, not quickly, but with the systematic determination of people who know they'll need this passage kept open no matter what. The wooden doors reinforced with iron are closed now against the night, but examine the threshold itself, the place where door meets stone. Do you see it? A gap, perhaps 3 inches high, running the width of the entrance. It looks like poor carpentry, like a mistake. It isn't. That gap is deliberate, essential. It allows air exchange when the doors are barred, not enough to create a dangerous draft, but enough to prevent suffocation when the great hall fills with smoke from the central hearth. It's one of 100 such calculations embedded in the castle's design invisible knowledge that kept people alive through winters that could last from October to April. Above the door, carved into the limestone, there's a face. Not a gargoyle or a noble's crest, but something older, a green man. His mouth open in a perpetual exhalation, leaves spilling from his lips. A pagan symbol surviving into Christian times because its meaning was too important to abandon. The breath of the forest, the cycle of death and return, the promise that winter always ends if you can endure long enough to see spring. The wind gusts again, carrying a scent that cuts through the cold, thick wood smoke, heavy with pine resin and damp peat. It's a poor fuel, more smoke than heat, but it's what's left when oak and ash run low in the depths of winter. Somewhere inside those walls, 200 souls are settling into the darkness. Lords and ladies in their solar, knights and men-at-arms in the garrison quarters, servants crowding the kitchen's residual warmth. And in the great hall, the heart of this stone organism, the entire household gathering in a ritual older than Christianity, older than Rome, the evening's convergence around fire. But they're not huddling for warmth alone. They're participating in something their bodies understand, even if their minds cannot name it, the collective generation of heat that makes the difference between survival and slow death. 200 breathing humans, each one producing roughly 100 watts of thermal energy together, creating the equivalent of a small furnace that heats not through flame, but through presence. The castle knows this. The castle has always known this. The walls were built to hold not just people, but the invisible envelope of warmth they create together. This is why the Great Hall has such a high ceiling, not for grandeur, but to create a thermal buffer zone where hot, smoke-filled air can accumulate above while breathable air remains below. This is why the windows are placed exactly where they are not for light, but to prevent downdrafts from disrupting that delicate stratification. The snow has begun again, smaller flakes, now falling straight down through perfectly still air. The wind has paused its assault-gathering strength for the next surge. In this moment of suspension, you can hear something, a deep, almost subsonic rumble from within the castle walls. Is it the settling of stone under temperature stress? The groan of timber beams contracting in the cold? Or something else, the sound of a structure responding to winter's pressure, adjusting its internal tensions, finding a new equilibrium? Whatever it is, it's alive in a way modern buildings never are. This castle will stand here for 600 years, beyond this night outlasting empires surviving fires and sieges, and the slow erosion of relevance. But tonight, in 1430, it's doing what it was truly built for, keeping the cold at bay, not through dominance, but through understanding. It's time now. Time to step across that threshold, to leave the killing cold behind and enter the stone organism's embrace. Time to see what survival really meant in an age when winter came not as inconvenience, but as existential test. The door opens just wide enough for a body to slip through. Quick now, don't let the warmth escape, and close it firmly behind you. We're inside. The first sensation isn't warmth. It's the absence of wind. After even a few minutes in the courtyard's bitter assault, the sudden stillness feels almost religious. A held breath, a sanctuary not from cold, but from movement. Your ears, which had been filled with the constant pressure of wind, now register a different soundscape entirely. The distant murmur of voices from deeper within the occasional crack of wood, in a fire somewhere above and underneath, everything. A kind of sonic presence you can feel more than hear. The sound of stone being stone, mass existing in space. But let's not move deeper yet. Stand here in this entrance passage, this liminal space between outside and inside, and let your senses adjust. Because what you're experiencing now is the first principle of castle survival in winter environmental gradation. The medieval builders understood without thermodynamics or physics that harsh transitions kill. You don't step from -20 degrees directly into a heated hall. You pass through layers, allowing your body to adjust, preventing the thermal shock that could stop an elderly heart or trigger pneumonia in fragile lungs. This passage, 20 feet long, stone vaulted, barely wide enough for two people to pass each other, serves as what modern science would call an airlock. But it's more sophisticated than that. Look at the floor. It's slightly ramped, rising perhaps 6 inches from the outer door to the inner. Not enough to notice consciously, but enough to encourage cold air, which is denser and heavier, to pool at the entrance rather than flooding the interior. And see those channels carved into the stone on either side. In summer, they carry away rain. In winter, they collect the meltwater from snow carried in on boots and cloaks, preventing the interior floors from becoming dangerously slick with ice. Your eyes are adjusting now to the gloom. The only light comes from a single rushlight in a wall sconce, a humble twig of rush plant, about as thick as a pencil soaked in sheep tallow and slowly, smokily burning. It provides roughly the illumination of a birthday candle. But even this meager glow tells you something. This passage is deemed worthy of light, which means it's maintained, monitored, respected as crucial infrastructure. Notice the walls here. Unlike the outer faces, which are dressed stone carefully cut and fitted, these interior surfaces are rougher, almost deliberately so. Run your hand along them. Feel that texture. It's not carved. It's natural fracture planes in the limestone left unfinished. This roughness serves multiple purposes. It provides grip for hands when the passage is icy. It increases surface area, allowing the stone to absorb and release moisture more efficiently. And it does something else, something the builders couldn't have named it. Disrupts laminar airflow, creating turbulence that prevents cold drafts from penetrating deeper into the castle with knife-like precision. There's a smell here. You need to register stone dust and lime mortar dampness, and age, but also something organic. Wool lanolin from countless cloaks that have brushed these walls. Smoke particles embedded in the limestone. The accumulated molecular presence of centuries of human passage. This passage remembers every person who's crossed this threshold, holding their invisible traces in its porous matrix. Now the inner door, it's smaller than the outer, deliberately so. Smaller openings lose less heat. But look at how it's hung not on iron hinges, which would conduct cold directly through the wood, but on wooden pintles set into limestone sockets with a small gap packed with moss for insulation. The door itself is oak 4 inches thick, with the grain running vertically for maximum strength. But what you might miss, unless you examine the edge closely, is the leather gasket, a strip of boiled hardened cowhide nailed along the frame that compresses when the door closes, creating a seal against drafts. Someone maintains this. Someone checks that leather gasket, regularly replaces it when it cracks. Understands that this humble detail could mean the difference between tolerable cold and unbearable cold for the 200 people sheltering within. That person is part of the castle's living system, as essential as the stone itself. Through the door now and into the castle's body proper. The space that opens before you isn't what you might expect. There's no grand entrance hall, no soaring space designed to intimidate visitors. Instead, you're in what amounts to a stone corridor, perhaps 12 feet wide, that runs along the interior of the curtain wall. To your right, another passage leads toward the kitchens. You can smell yeast and old meat from that direction. To your left, a narrow spiral staircase winds upward into darkness, leading to the garrison chambers, and above those, the family's private quarters. But straight ahead, light flickers through a wide archway, the Great Hall. Before we enter, look up at the ceiling of this corridor. It's vaulted, yes. But the stones forming the vault aren't smooth. They're covered, completely covered with what looks like pale moss or lichen, a thin coating that's slightly damp to the touch. This is calcium carbonate efflorescence, leaching out from the lime mortar as moisture moves through the walls. Modern restoration would remove it, deeming it damage. But in 1430, it serves a purpose. This crystalline coating helps regulate humidity, absorbing excess moisture when the air is too damp, releasing it slowly when conditions are dry. The castle is managing its own internal climate. Through chemistry the builders never studied, but somehow facilitated. The floor beneath your feet is worth noting too. It's not bare stone. Instead, it's covered with compressed rushes, laid down in thick mats and changed seasonally. In summer, these would be fresh green reeds mixed with aromatic herbs, mint meadow, sweet lavender. In winter, they're older browner, but still functional. They provide insulation from the stone's cold muffle footsteps and crucially absorb moisture that would otherwise condense on the floor and freeze into treacherous ice during the coldest nights. Now, finally, step toward the archway and the great hall beyond. But pause at the threshold one more time, because what you're about to enter isn't just a room. It's the organism's heart, the place where the castle's passive systems converge, where human presence becomes part of the thermal infrastructure, where survival transforms from individual struggle into collective achievement. Feel that the air is noticeably warmer here. Not comfortable by modern standards, you'd estimate perhaps 55 degrees Fahrenheit, but after the killing cold outside, it feels almost tropical. Your lungs expand more easily. Your fingers, which had begun to stiffen in the entrance passage, start to tingle with returning circulation. The great hall opens before you, and even in the dim light of 24 rushlights and the central hearth, it's massive. 80 feet long, 40 feet wide, with a timber-vaulted ceiling that soars 40 feet overhead. But what strikes you immediately isn't the size, it's the occupancy. There are people everywhere, not crowded, but present, distributed throughout the space in clusters that seem random, but are actually carefully calibrated by social hierarchy and thermal necessity. Near the central hearth, which sits in the middle of the floor in a shallow stone basin, the Lord's family occupies raised seating. They're close enough to benefit from radiant heat, but not so close as to be overwhelmed by smoke. At the lower end of the hall nearest the kitchen entrance, servants and lower-ranked household members gather on benches and floor mats. And along the walls, hanging from iron pegs, are those heavy wool tapestries you've read about. But seeing them in use, you understand their function differently. They're not just decoration. They're three-dimensional thermal regulators. Behind each tapestry is a gap of perhaps 6 inches between the fabric and the stone wall. In that gap, air circulates, warm air rising from human bodies, cold air sinking from the wall. The tapestry baffles this circulation, preventing it from creating harsh drafts, while still allowing enough movement to prevent dangerous humidity buildup. Touch one of these tapestries as you pass, and you'll find it slightly damp, slightly warm, actively participating in the hall's climate control. But there's something else you notice now, something harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore the sound. Not the individual voices, but the collective acoustic presence of 200 people, breathing, shifting, existing together in an enclosed space. Their exhalations are creating the carbon dioxide and water vapor that the castle's ventilation system is slowly, continuously extracting through those hidden airways and vents. Their body heat is creating convection currents that rise to the ceiling and spread outward, warming the timber beams and preventing dangerous condensation that could rot the wood. They don't know they're doing this. They just know that gathering together in the Great Hall every evening isn't optional, it's survival. And the castle, in its wordless stone wisdom, was built to harness this human presence, to transform it from a vulnerability into an asset. You're part of it now. Just by standing here, your body is contributing approximately 100 watts of thermal energy to the hall's collective warmth. Your breath is adding moisture to the air moisture that will eventually condense in the condensation wells we'll visit later. Your presence matters in a way that's both humbling and profound. This is what living inside a medieval castle winter really means, becoming part of a system larger than yourself, where individual survival depends on collective participation, where the line between human and environment blurs into something older than architecture, older than civilization itself. The fire in the central hearth crackles, sending up sparks that rise toward the Louvre in the ceiling, that opening through which smoke can escape. Someone adds a log. The flames surge briefly, casting dancing shadows on the walls, on the faces gathered near on the stone that holds all of this fragile warmth in its cold, patient embrace. We'll stay here a while. There's much to observe. But first, let's understand the enemy we're hiding from the winter that waits outside these walls, the cold that will define every decision, every adaptation, every breath taken until spring returns. The winter outside isn't waiting patiently, it's advancing. If you could see through these stone walls the way a hawk sees through air, you'd witness something terrifying in its consistency, a front of Arctic air hundreds of miles wide, pushing south from Greenland across the North Atlantic. It's traveling at roughly 30 miles per hour, and it's been traveling for 3 days, gathering cold as it moves over pack ice and frozen seas. By the time it reaches England, it carries a temperature of minus 25 degrees Celsius at ground level, cold enough to kill exposed flesh in minutes, cold enough to freeze the moisture in your lungs if you breathe too deeply. This is the winter of 1430, but it could be any winter in the coldest decade of the 15th century. The Little Ice Age, as future scholars will name it, isn't a single catastrophic event. It's a slow tightening of the climate's grip, year after year, decade after decade, until patterns that held for centuries, when to plant, when to expect thaw, become unreliable, then useless. The old knowledge fails. People improvise, adapt, or die. Let's talk about what cold really does. Modern science understands it as the absence of molecular motion. As temperature drops, atoms vibrate less, releasing their kinetic energy to the environment until at absolute zero, all movement theoretically stops. But medieval people lacking this framework understood cold in more direct terms, as a force, a presence, something that entered your body and stole your life heat, leaving behind numbness and eventually stillness. They weren't entirely wrong. When air temperature drops below zero, Celsius water molecules in your exhaled breath begin to crystallize instantly. You can see this as the cloud of vapor that forms with every breath. But what you don't see is how that same process is happening inside your respiratory tract, your nasal passages, the delicate tissue of your lungs. Your body fights back by shunting blood away from extremities toward your core, sacrificing fingers and toes to keep your heart and brain functioning. Within an hour of exposure to minus 20 degrees, frostbite begins. Within 3 hours, hypothermia becomes likely. Within 6, if you haven't found shelter, you enter what's called the paradoxical undressing phase. Your brain, starved of oxygen and confused by failing circulation, convinces you that you're actually burning up, and you begin removing clothing just before death. The castle knows this. The castle has always known this. Stand near one of the narrow windows, these arrow slits that pierce the thick walls at intervals designed for defense. Not comfort, and you can feel the cold radiating inward like something alive, something patient and hungry. But place your hand on the stone wall itself and notice something unexpected. It's not as cold as you'd think. Not warm, certainly, perhaps 10 degrees Celsius, but not the bone-shattering cold of the air outside. This is the first mystery we need to understand why the stone isn't as cold as the winter surrounding it. The answer lies 40 feet beneath where you're standing, deeper than the castle's cellars, deeper than the foundations themselves in the Earth's thermally stable zone. Below approximately 6 feet of depth in England's latitude, soil temperature remains relatively constant year-round at roughly 10 to 12 degrees Celsius. This isn't geothermal energy in the volcanic sense. There are no hot springs here, no tectonic activity. Instead, it's the thermal inertia of the Earth itself. During summer, the soil absorbs solar radiation, storing heat in its mass. During winter, when the surface freezes and snow blankets the ground that stored heat, releases slowly migrating upward through conduction at a rate of perhaps 1 degree per month. The castle's foundations tap into this reservoir unconsciously by simply existing in contact with the earth. The massive limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, act as thermal conduits. Heat from the stable soil zone conducts slowly through the stone, flowing toward the colder surfaces, both exterior and interior walls, at a rate determined by limestone's thermal conductivity, which is approximately 1.3 watts per meter Kelvin. You don't need to understand these numbers. The castle's builders certainly didn't. But they understood something deeper that stone remembers, that a building sunk deep enough into Earth becomes part of Earth's thermal cycle, participating in exchanges that happen on seasonal timescales, indifferent to daily fluctuations. This is why castles were built with such deep cellars, often descending 30 or 40 feet into bedrock. Modern historians will tell you it's for storage for wine and grain preservation. And yes, that's true. The stable, cool temperature of cellars prevents spoilage. But there's another reason, one that's less documented, because it was so obvious to medieval builders that they never bothered writing it down. Cellars are the castle's connection to the Earth's heat reservoir. On a night like tonight, when surface temperature has plummeted to -20, the cellars maintain their steady 10 degrees. The air in those lowest chambers, thick with the smell of stored wine casks, hanging salted meat barrels of grain, is bearable, survivable, even without fire. That warmed air rises through the castle's internal spaces, via convection mixing with the colder air from above, moderating the temperature just enough to prevent lethal cold from penetrating the living quarters. The castle breathes earth heat upward. It's doing so right now as you stand here. The stone beneath your feet is perhaps 2 degrees warmer than the stone at eye level. Touch the floor, then touch the wall at shoulder height. Feel that difference. That's the Earth's pulse transmitted through limestone, keeping the interior just habitable enough to sustain life. But the cold outside is relentless, and earth heat alone isn't sufficient. the castle needs another strategy, another layer of passive resistance. Look at how the walls are constructed, not as a single thickness of stone, but as two parallel walls, an outer face and an inner face, with the space between filled with rubble core. Smaller stones, chips of limestone dust, all packed tightly with lime mortar. This core serves multiple purposes. It adds mass, making the walls stable against siege engines and undermining. But it also creates something remarkable, a buffer zone, where thermal gradients can dissipate gradually, rather than conducting cold directly from exterior to interior. Think of it like this. The outer wall surface exposed to -20-degree air might itself cool to -10. But that cold has to migrate through 12 feet of heterogeneous material limestone blocks. Mortar, rubble, core, more. Mortar, more limestone. Each with slightly different thermal properties, each resisting heat flow in its own way. By the time that cold reaches the inner wall surface, it's been attenuated, slowed, reduced to perhaps 5 degrees above the outer temperature. Not warm, but survivable. The stone has absorbed the worst of winter's assault, bearing the brunt of it in its mass, so that the humans sheltering behind those walls don't have to. There's a word for this in modern physics: thermal mass. But medieval stonemasons called it something simpler, something more honest: thickness. When in doubt, build it thicker. This isn't the crumbling ruin of a medieval documentary. This is a highly functional thermal battery actively modulating the temperature difference between life and death. Outside, the wind has picked up again, and you can hear it now even through the wall's incredible thickness, a low moan that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the structure like a bass note held indefinitely. This wind is dangerous, not just because of its temperature, but because of wind chill, the convective removal of heat from any exposed surface. At -20 degrees Celsius with a 30-mile-per-hour wind, the effective temperature, what it feels like to living tissue, is closer to -40. At that temperature, exposed flesh freezes in 5 minutes. But the wind does something else too. Something that helps the castle rather than hindering it. It creates pressure. Differentials that drive the castle's passive ventilation system. The side of the castle facing the wind experiences positive pressure air pushing against the walls, trying to find entry points. The leeward side sheltered from direct wind experiences. Negative pressure, a partial vacuum that pulls air outward through vents and openings. The builders knew this intuitively. That's why ventilation shafts always have at least 2 openings positioned on different walls to ensure cross-ventilation regardless of wind direction. Tonight, with the wind from the north, the shafts opening on the northern wall are drawing in cold, fresh air, which sinks to the cellars where it's warmed by contact with earth, while the southern shafts are exhausting stale, warm moisture. Laden air from the upper chambers. The castle is using the wind's energy to breathe, converting an enemy into an ally through nothing more than strategic positioning of holes in stone. Now let's talk about what's happening to the landscape beyond these walls. The Thames, that great river, which is London's lifeline, is freezing. Not at its edges, that happens every winter, but across its entire width, bank to bank. Ice is forming from the bottom up, as well as the top down, creating a solid mass that will soon be thick enough to support the weight of horses and carts. When this happens, and it will happen 5 times this decade, commerce stops. Ships can't move. The coal that normally arrives from Newcastle to heat London's homes and shops remains in distant harbours. Firewood prices triple, quadruple. People burn furniture, books, anything combustible. The wealthy retreat to stone manors with deep cellars and thick walls, castles, in other words. The poor freeze in thousands. But here in this castle, the cold is held at bay by mass and patience and the slow breathing of stone. The temperature inside will drop, yes, perhaps to 15 degrees Celsius in the Great Hall, to 10 in the upper chambers, to 5 in the guardroom of the gatehouse. Cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to need wool and fur. But not cold enough to kill, not if you understand how to work with what the castle provides. And that's the crucial lesson of medieval winter survival that modern people have forgotten. You don't fight the cold with heat alone. You fight it with understanding, with observation, with respect for the systems that stone and earth and human presence create when they work together instead of against each other. The castle isn't keeping you warm. That's not its job. Its job is keeping you just not cold enough to die while you sleep, while you endure, while you wait for spring. And in that narrow margin between death and comfort, human resilience finds room to persist. Outside, the temperature is still dropping. Midnight approaches, and with it the coldest hours of the night. The wind howls, the snow falls, the winter advances in its slow, patient assault. But inside these walls, the earth keeps bleeding its warmth upward through limestone, and life continues, breath after breath, heartbeat after heartbeat. The castle holds. There's a place in this castle most people never see, and fewer understand. Follow me now down the spiral staircase in the southeastern tower. Careful, these steps are worn smooth by centuries of use. And in this cold, they're treacherous with condensation. Down below the level of the Great Hall, below the kitchens, below the storerooms, where grain and dried fish wait in barrels. Down into the belly of the castle where stone meets earth, in a marriage that predates this structure, predates England itself, stretches back to the first moment humans realized they could dig for warmth. The cellars. But not just any cellar, the deep cellar, the one built when this castle was founded in the 11th century, back when the Normans brought their stone-building expertise to an island that had mostly forgotten such knowledge. This chamber extends 42 feet below ground level, carved partially from the bedrock itself, with walls of dressed limestone rising from a floor that remains bare earth, tamped hard, but earth nonetheless. The temperature here never changes. 10 degrees Celsius in August. 10 degrees Celsius tonight when the surface world has plunged to -20. This is what geologists call the thermal neutral zone, the depth at which daily and even seasonal temperature fluctuations cease to penetrate, where the Earth's own internal warmth becomes the dominant force. Stand in the candlelit center of the chamber, and you can feel it, a faint warmth rising from the earth. It isn't fire-made or human-made. The packed soil is only slightly warmer than the air, but warmer than anything above ground. This is last summer's sunlight stored in clay and stone, sinking inch by inch until winter makes it precious. The medieval people who built this understood something profound. The earth is a battery charging in summer, discharging in winter. Not quickly. Earth doesn't give up its warmth in sudden bursts. It releases it with geological patience, steadily, reliably asking nothing in return except that you dig deep enough to find where it keeps its treasure. But there's more happening here than simple heat storage. Look at the walls of this chamber, specifically where they meet the floor. Do you see those dark patches? Those areas where the limestone glistens slightly in the candlelight? That's not water leaking in from outside. It's water condensing out of the air itself, pulled from invisibility by the temperature differential between air and stone. Here's how it works. The air in the great hall above is filled with moisture. The exhalations of 200 humans, the steam from cooking the damp wool of cloaks that never fully dry. This humid air warm relative to the cellar descends through the stairwells and storage rooms, sinking because it's denser than the cold air below. When it reaches this chamber, it encounters stone surfaces that are cooler than the air itself. Water vapor, unable to remain gaseous at this lower temperature, condenses on the stone, forming droplets that coalesce and run down the wall into channels deliberately carved to collect them. The builders called these channels water weepers, and every castle had them. But their function wasn't well documented because, again, it seemed too obvious to mention. Why would you write down that condensation provides drinking water when everyone knows that? But we've forgotten, and now we need to relearn. The castle is collecting its own water supply from the breath of its inhabitants, from the moisture that would otherwise rot timbers and promote deadly molds. It's turning a problem into a solution, passively, continuously asking only that humans keep breathing. Follow one of these channels, now carved into the cellar floor leading toward the southeastern corner. It empties into a stone basin, a shallow depression, perhaps 3 feet across, lined with lead sheeting that someone centuries ago understood would prevent the water from simply soaking back into the earth. This basin fills slowly and visibly, a few drops per hour from each of the dozens of weeper channels throughout the cellar system. By morning, it will hold several gallons of fresh water, free of the contaminants that make river water dangerous in winter, free of the suspended sediment that makes well water cloudy. This is water that never saw the sky. It came from human lungs captured by stones stored by earth. It's the castle drinking its own breath, sustaining itself through chemistry the builders couldn't name but absolutely understood. Now, climb back up those stairs, but only partway. Stop at the level of the main storerooms, roughly 15 feet below ground. Notice how the temperature has changed. It's perhaps 12 degrees here, warmer than the deep cellar, but still well below the Great Hall's temperature. This is the gradient zone where earth heat and living heat mix, where the castle's thermal management becomes most sophisticated. These storerooms are where the castle keeps its calories, the grain that will be ground into flour, the salted pork that will sustain the household through March, the barrels of ale and wine that provide not just intoxication, but essential nutrition in an age before refrigeration, before canning, before any preservation method except cold salt and fermentation. But notice where the wine barrels are placed against the northern wall, the coldest wall where the temperature remains closest to the cellar's deep chill. Wine needs stability. Temperature swings cause corks to loosen, allowing air to enter and spoil the contents. By storing wine against the northern wall, using the exterior cold to maintain consistent low temperature, the castle is leveraging the very winter that threatens human life to preserve the liquid calories that help humans survive winter. And look at how the grain storage has been organized. Not in one large heap which would allow rats and rot to spread unchecked, but in dozens of smaller barrels, each raised slightly off the floor on wooden platforms. This elevation prevents ground moisture from wicking up into the grain, but it also creates air gaps beneath each barrel gaps, where the rising warmth from the deep cellar can circulate gently, keeping the grain just dry enough to prevent mold without desiccating it completely. No one living here in 1430 could explain this in scientific terms. But someone generations ago noticed that grain stored this way lasted longer, tasted better. Someone observed, adjusted, refined the method through trial and error until it worked. That knowledge passed from steward to steward, undocumented except in practice, preserved in the physical arrangement of barrels and platforms more reliably than any manuscript could preserve it. This is how castles really survived, not through grand strategies or noble sacrifice, but through 10,000 small observations, each one building on the last, creating a system of such complexity that no single person could comprehend it all. The castle is the collective wisdom of generations, crystallized in stone and custom breathing, and drinking and storing and protecting without conscious thought. There's one more thing you need to see in this storage level, the ventilation shafts I mentioned earlier. Here's where you can see them clearly, 3-foot square openings in the ceiling, rising up through the walls to emerge somewhere on the battlements high above. These shafts are never blocked, never sealed even in the worst winter storms. And if you stand beneath one now, you'll feel something unexpected, a gentle downward current of cold air. Cold air is sinking through the shaft, drawn by gravity and by the pressure differential created by wind blowing across the shaft's upper opening. This cold air pools in these storage chambers, displacing the warmer air which rises through the stairwells toward the great hall above. The system is creating a slow, continuous circulation, cold down, warm up, that moves air through the entire castle without any mechanical assistance, driven purely by density differences and pressure gradients. But here's the crucial insight: this circulation isn't trying to warm the entire castle to some uniform temperature. That would be impossible with medieval technology, and attempting it would exhaust fuel supplies within weeks. Instead, the system creates zones deep cold in the cellars, moderate chill in the storage levels, relative warmth in the living quarters. Each zone is appropriate for its function. Each zone is maintained by the castle's passive architecture, by stone and earth, working in silent partnership. The humans living here learned to navigate these zones, to dress appropriately for each, to understand that going to the deep cellars meant adding another layer of wool, even though you were technically indoors. They learned to read the castle's thermal landscape the way a sailor reads currents in water, not through instruments, but through attention, through respect for forces larger than themselves. This learning wasn't written in books. It was written in the body's memory, in the way your lungs expanded differently at different levels, in the way moisture in your breath vanished or lingered depending on where you stood. The castle taught you its rhythms, if you survived long enough to learn them. In the deep cellar, heat rises from earth. In the storage levels, air circulates through natural convection. And in the great hall above, humans gather to share the warmth of their own presence. 3 systems, 3 temperatures, 3 ways of holding life in the face of killing cold, all passive, all sustainable for months on end, all absolutely essential. The castle isn't a building, It's an ecology stone, earth, air, human, all participating in exchanges that predate architecture, that connect back to the first caves, where fire-warmed air rose and cold air sank, and primitive humans learned to position themselves in the warmth rising from below, rather than fighting the cold descending from above. We'll return to the Great Hall now, but you'll never see it the same way again. Because now, you know what's beneath it, what's feeding it, warmth from below, what's pulling stale air away and replacing it with cold, fresh air that will be warmed in turn. You know, the castle isn't containing heat so much as managing cold, creating gradients, instead of uniformity, working with winter's physics, instead of against them. The candle gutters and nearly goes out in a breath of cold air from above. Someone will have to replace it soon. These cellars are never left completely dark, because in darkness, even familiar spaces become death traps. But for now, it holds its small flame, a mirror of the larger flame in the Great Hall, both of them islands of light in a winter that surrounds this stone refuge, like a cold and patient ocean. Time to ascend, but slowly. Let your body adjust to the warmth as you rise. Let the castle teach you through your own sensations how its systems work. Trust the stone. It's kept people alive for 400 years before you, and it will keep them alive for 600 years after. The earth holds, the castle breathes, and somehow in that exchange, winter becomes survivable. Morning arrives, not with sunrise, but with sound. In the deep winter of the 1430s, light comes late and reluctant. You've been asleep in the Great Hall, curled on a pallet of straw, covered with wool blankets, positioned with 50 others along the edges of the room. As the first grey light filters in, you hear the distinct, muffled sounds of people rising from shared sleep, the rustle of straw, the coughs of waking lungs, the collective shifting of bodies that have spent the night borrowing warmth from one another. This communal waking isn't just a lack of privacy. It's a fundamental aspect of medieval life, where the day begins not in isolation, but in the immediate shared reality of the group. The first task of morning, before eating, before prayers, before anything else, is reading the castle. This isn't a metaphor. The castle communicates through signs that must be checked, interpreted, acted upon. Let me show you what I mean. Follow the chamberlain, an older man named Robert, who's held this position for 2 decades and knows this castle's language better than anyone alive. He's already up, already moving through the pre-dawn darkness with a single candle and a mind cataloguing 100 subtle observations. First, the ventilation shafts. Robert climbs the narrow staircase to the 2nd level, enters a small chamber where 3 shafts converge, and simply stands there, still listening. Not with his ears alone, with his entire body. Is there a draught? Too strong a draught means excessive heat loss. No draught means dangerous air stagnation, the build-up of what they call bad air, what we now know as carbon dioxide, that causes headaches and eventually suffocation. The ideal is a gentle, steady flow you can feel more than hear, like breathing. Today, there's almost no movement. Robert frowns. The shaft opening on the northern wall must be blocked by snowdrift. He makes a mental note. Someone will need to climb to the battlements despite the cold, despite the danger of ice, and clear that opening. Because without air exchange, the moisture from 200 people breathing all night will condense on the walls, promoting mold growth that can kill more surely than cold, simply more slowly. Next, the walls themselves. Robert places his bare hand against the stone in several specific locations. Locations he's learned through years of experience are diagnostic. The south wall should always be slightly warmer than the north wall, absorbing what meager sunlight penetrates the snow clouds. If it's not, that means snow has accumulated against the exterior, insulating the wall from any solar gain. Near windows, there should be condensation on the stone moisture from interior air meeting cold surface, but not too much. Too much means inadequate ventilation. Too little means the interior air is becoming dangerously dry, which cracks lips, dries nasal passages, and makes respiratory infections more likely. Today, Robert finds proof on the west wall, damp stone and a thin trail of water. It isn't a leak, the wall is too thick. It's condensation showing the castle's air is circulating properly. The moisture follows a carved groove in the mortar flowing down to a drain that leads to the cellar's weeper channels. The system works. The castle is breathing, releasing moisture exactly as designed. But there's another reason Robert checks these walls so carefully: ice. When moisture freezes inside stone, it expands, creating pressure that can crack even limestone. A single freeze-thaw cycle won't destroy a wall, but decades of them will. The castle is gradually being damaged by the very winter it's designed to resist a slow attrition that will eventually require repairs no amount of passive design can prevent. But that's a problem for future generations. Right now, Robert's job is ensuring the castle survives this winter, this week, this day. In another chamber, Robert examines the floor rushes. In the great hall, they're trampled, flat and dark with spilled ale, but here in the guardroom, they're still relatively fresh. He kneels, parts them, and checks the stone floor beneath. It's dry. Good. If moisture were accumulating under the rushes, it would freeze overnight, creating invisible ice patches that could send someone sprawling. Later today, the soiled rushes in the Great Hall will be swept out and burned, replaced with fresh ones that will add a fractional layer of insulation between feet and cold stone. Now, the most crucial check: the food stores. Robert descends to the storage level we visited earlier, candle casting huge shadows as he moves among the barrels and hanging sides of meat. He's looking for something specific: frost formation. On the northern wall, where wine is stored, there's a thin rime of ice forming on the stone. This is actually good. It means the wall temperature is staying consistently below freezing, naturally refrigerating the stores. But on the eastern wall, where grain barrels are kept, frost would be disastrous. Moisture from the grain would condense, freeze, and when it thawed in spring, turn the grain into a moldy, inedible mass. Robert finds no frost on the eastern wall. The warm air rising from the deep cellars is keeping this area just above freezing cold enough to slow spoilage, warm enough to prevent frost. The balance is holding. As he checks each barrel, Robert also listens. Grain should be silent. Any rustling means rats, which means the castle's population of working cats isn't keeping pace with rodent infiltration. Wine barrels should occasionally tick and creak as the liquid inside adjusts to temperature changes. Silence from a wine barrel might mean it's frozen solid, which would split the wooden staves and waste gallons of precious liquid. Today, the grain is quiet, the wine is ticking softly. Everything is as it should be. But Robert's morning rounds aren't finished. There's one more check, perhaps the most important of all, and it requires going outside. The courtyard at dawn in January 1430 is a hostile place. The sky is the colour of dirty pewter, neither light nor dark, but a luminous dimness that makes it impossible to judge time. Snow has fallen during the night, not a blizzard, but a steady accumulation that's added another 6 inches to the existing pack. The courtyard, once a space of activity and commerce, is now a white expanse, broken only by the paths that have been trampled between essential buildings. The great hall to the kitchen to the well to the gatehouse. Robert doesn't go far. He's checking the well not to draw water that will come later, but to verify it hasn't frozen solid. Wells freeze from the top down with a layer of surface ice that thickens gradually if the cold persists long enough. A completely frozen well means no water access except by melting snow, which requires fuel that's already in short supply. Robert breaks through the thin ice layer with a pole kept nearby for this purpose, confirming that liquid water remains beneath. The well is perhaps 30 feet deep, reaching below the frost line to where groundwater flows year-round. As long as they keep breaking the surface, ice daily, the well remains viable. He also checks the wood stores under the thatched shelter near the kitchen. The logs should be cold but dry. If moisture has penetrated, they'll be difficult to burn, wasting fuel in the attempt. He lifts several pieces, judges their weight, dry wood is lighter, and nods with satisfaction. Someone has been managing this critical resource correctly. These morning rounds take perhaps an hour, and they happen every single day without exception. They're not Robert's job alone. Multiple people throughout the castle perform similar checks in different domains. The kitchen master monitors food preparation and fire management. The captain of the guard monitors the gatehouse's defensive readiness, and more importantly, in winter, its thermal integrity. The priest monitors the chapel, ensuring its smaller spaces remain warm enough for early morning prayers. Together, these signs form the castle's daily diagnosis, a living body that must stay healthy to keep its people alive. The knowledge isn't written down. It's taught hand to hand, generation to generation, through watching and repeating. See how the stone sweats when the east wind blows. Hear the barrels click, that means the temperature holds. Never let the well ice grow past 3 inches. At 4, it's unbreakable. This is the real medieval survival skill that's been lost, not the ability to start a fire or hunt game, but the ability to read a building's health, to notice subtle changes in stone and wood and air, to anticipate problems before they become crises. The castle is the tool, but human observation is what makes the tool work. By the time Robert completes his rounds, other people are stirring. Servants emerge from the kitchen with wooden bowls of barley porridge, still warm from the pot that's been simmering over embers all night. It's not much gruel flavoured with a bit of salted pork, some dried herbs, but it provides calories, warmth, and the belly energy for the day ahead. In winter, the first meal of the day isn't about pleasure. It's about fuel. The human body, like the fire, needs feeding to maintain its heat. And then the real work begins, not heroic or dramatic, but constant. Wood hauled to hearths, snow cleared from narrow paths, door seals checked for cracks, tallow rendered for candles, grain ground to flour wool spun into thread. These small, relentless tasks are what keep the castle alive. But there's one task that stands out as uniquely medieval, uniquely suited to understanding how these people conceived of winter survival: the tending of warm corners. Across the castle, Certain corners are known to be warmer places, where cellar heat rises. Sunlight slips through south-facing windows, and drafts can't reach. These spots are quietly reserved for the vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, the young. Not by law, but by shared instinct. Winter survival means protecting those least able to endure it. In one such corner of the great hall, Agnes spins wool beneath a rare shaft of afternoon light. Her hands are twisted with age, her pace slow, but every thread she makes could become warmth for someone else. Her place there isn't privilege, it's practicality. Alive, she still matters. This is winter's economy, not kind, not cruel, just necessary. Everyone gives what they can. Everyone takes what they need. It isn't equal, but it's understood. No one survives winter alone. The day passes in small acts. A vent cleared a barrel, moved to colder ground. Spoilage delayed. No drama, no records kept, just quiet competence. This is how castles endured winter, not through grand decisions, but through constant attention practiced by people history forgot. Before dusk, Robert checks the cellar wells. Yesterday's condensation has frozen solid. He breaks the ice, carries it to the hearth. By nightfall, it will be water again. Breath returned to liquid, sustaining those who made it. The cycle holds. The castle breathes. Another winter day ends without disaster, victory enough. There's a kind of dark that exists only in winter, only in places where night comes early and stays late, where clouds seal the sky and stone walls seal the earth. It's not the darkness of a modern power outage which carries the promise of restoration, the memory of light. It's a darkness that feels permanent, ancient, patient as geology. The darkness of 1430 is a living presence, and it changes you. By 3 in the afternoon, what little daylight penetrated the snow clouds has begun its retreat. Inside the castle, the great hall transitions from dim to dimmer, and people begin the ritual that will define the next 14 hours, negotiating with darkness. Light in a medieval winter is expensive, prohibitively so. A pound of tallow, rendered animal fat for making cheap candles, costs roughly a day's wages for a labourer. Beeswax, which burns cleaner and longer, costs 4 times that. Do the math. A household of 200 people, each needing perhaps 2 hours of direct light for essential tasks, could consume several £100 of tallow in a single winter month. That's weeks of labour value gone as smoke. So light becomes precious, rationed, strategic. The Great Hall is allocated 3 large rushlights, bundles of rushes soaked in tallow, essentially torches that will burn for 3 to 4 hours, if managed carefully. They're positioned at key locations, one near the Lord's raised platform, one near the central hearth, one near the entrance to the kitchen passage. These islands of light create zones of activity. People gather in these zones to do whatever work requires vision, mending clothes, sharpening tools, eating the evening meal. Everything else happens in darkness or near darkness, in the penumbra between lit zones, where shapes are suggestions and faces become unrecognizable. But the castle has another source of light, one that costs nothing and fascinates me deeply because it reveals how intimately medieval people understood the natural world's subtle offerings. Follow me down to the storage cellars again, but this time notice what you couldn't see during our earlier visit, a faint green-blue glow emanating from stacks of firewood piled near the western wall. Get closer. The glow comes from the wood itself, not all of it, but certain pieces, particularly sections of decaying oak and birch that have been stored in the damp conditions of the cellar for months. This is foxfire, what modern science calls bioluminescence, the light produced by fungi, specifically species of Armillaria and Pinellus stypticus growing in the wood. As these fungi digest the lignin and cellulose chemical reactions, produce photons creating a cold light that requires no fuel, produces no heat, and lasts for months, until the wood becomes too decomposed to host the organisms. The medieval people who discovered this phenomenon didn't understand biochemistry, but they understood utility. Pieces of foxfire wood became tools, not for warmth, they barely burned anymore, but for navigation. Placed strategically in the darkest passages and stairwells, they provided just enough light to see the edge of a step, the corner of a wall, the threshold of a doorway. In complete darkness, your eyes adapt to remarkable sensitivity. A source that seems laughably dim in daylight becomes sufficient to navigate by after 20 minutes of adjustment. But foxfire did something more important than provide practical light. It provided psychological comfort. Humans fear darkness for reasons deeper than danger. We fear it because we evolved in a world where predators hunted in darkness, where darkness meant vulnerability. These fears don't vanish simply because you're inside stone walls. In winter, when darkness dominates 3/4 of every day, when you're trapped indoors for weeks at a time, those primal anxieties amplify. People become irritable, paranoid, prone to what medieval physicians recognized as melancholia, what we now understand as seasonal affective disorder caused by insufficient light exposure. Foxfire helped. The gentle bioluminescent glow visible in darkness, invisible in daylight, created an impression that the castle itself was alive, that it watched over you with soft, patient eyes. This subtle, almost magical interaction with nature is rarely captured in a medieval documentary, yet it was essential. You'd walk down a corridor in the deepest night, and those green-blue patches would guide you, would remind you that life persists, even in places that seem lifeless, that decay itself produces light, that nothing is truly dark if you know how to look. The folklore around foxfire reflects this psychological dimension. In the stories told in the Great Hall on long winter nights, foxfire is described as the souls of the forest, following humans into stone buildings to keep watch over them. It's the blessing of the wood, a reminder that even dead trees serve the living. These stories aren't scientifically accurate, but they're psychologically astute by attributing intention to foxfire, by making it a guardian rather than a random phenomenon. People transformed a source of anxiety, strange light in darkness, into a source of comfort. Let's return to the Great Hall now, where evening has settled fully, and the human response to darkness is reaching its peak, the telling of stories. This isn't entertainment in the modern sense, though it certainly entertains. It's a survival strategy for mental health, for social cohesion, for the maintenance of communal identity under conditions of extreme stress. Near the central hearth, where the largest rushlight burns and the fire has been built up for the evening gathering, approximately 50 people have arranged themselves in concentric circles. The innermost circle closest to the light and warmth is reserved for the elderly and the storytellers. The outer circles fade into shadow, but everyone can hear, and hearing is what matters. Tonight, the storyteller is a man named William, a former soldier who served in France and carries with him an endless store of memories, some true, some embellished, some entirely fabricated, but no less valuable for that. He's telling a story about winter in the siege of Harfleur, how the English army survived through brutal cold that killed as many men as combat did, how they learned to dig into earth for warmth, how the frozen mud became their enemy and their fortress both. Why this story tonight? Because it serves multiple functions simultaneously. First, it's educational. William's descriptions of how soldiers created windbreaks and managed campfires in freezing conditions contained practical knowledge that might save lives if this castle were ever besieged in winter. The listeners absorb this information without thinking of it as instruction. They simply follow the narrative and the knowledge embeds itself. Second, it's bonding. Everyone in this hall is surviving the same winter. By hearing about survival in even harsher conditions, they feel less isolated, more capable, more connected to a larger human story of resilience. When William describes the moment when dawn finally broke after the longest night of the siege, and men who thought they'd die discovered they'd lived, there's a palpable emotional response in the hall, not triumph, but something quieter, deeper recognition. We know what that feels like. We've felt our own version of that. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it passes time. In winter, when outdoor work is impossible and indoor work is limited by lack of light, time becomes oppressive. Hours stretch. Boredom becomes a physical sensation, an itch in the mind that can drive people to irrational behavior. Storytelling consumes time productively, makes it move, gives it structure. From evening prayers until bedtime is perhaps 4 hours an eternity in darkness. But a good storyteller can make those 4 hours contract into what feels like minutes, reducing the psychological burden of winter's enforced stillness. As William speaks, his words create mental images more vivid than any light could illuminate. The frozen fields of France materialize in each listener's mind, populated by figures more real than memory. This is the magic of verbal storytelling. In an oral culture, it colonizes the darkness with imagination, filling the space that vision can't reach with narratives that give shape and meaning to formless time. Around the periphery of the gathering, other activities are happening quietly. A woman is teaching a girl to card wool, a task that requires touch more than sight. 2 men are playing a simple board game, feeling the positions of pieces rather than seeing them. An elderly couple sits in companionable silence, their hands clasp their presents together, sufficient entertainment for the evening. This is the social ecology of winter darkness, a complex web of interaction that doesn't require constant stimulation, because constant stimulation would be exhausting. Instead, people drift between engagement and rest, between focused activity and passive presence, between speaking and listening, creating a rhythm that makes the hours not just bearable, but sometimes, if you're lucky, almost pleasant. But there's a shadow in this scene that we need to acknowledge. Not everyone finds winter darkness bearable. In a far corner of the hall beyond the light of the rushes, a young man sits alone. His name is Thomas, and he's been struggling since November. The darkness weighs on him differently than others. He sleeps during the day when sleep is least needed, and lies awake at night unable to rest. He's irritable, prone to sudden anger over small things. He's stopped participating in evening gatherings, preferring isolation, even though isolation in winter is dangerous. The castle's residents have noticed. They don't have a name for what's happening to Thomas' depression's seasonal affective disorder, but they recognize the pattern. It happens to someone almost every winter, sometimes more than one person. The darkness gets inside some people differently than others, and no amount of fire or company can push it back out. What happens to Thomas depends on the community's response. In some winters, in some castles, people like Thomas are cared for, given the warmest corners, the best food, patient companionship, even when they reject it. In other winters, they're seen as burdens, as weak, as risks to collective morale. Sometimes they're sent away to monasteries, where monks trained in the care of troubled souls might help. Sometimes they simply disappear into the darkness they can't escape. Tonight, an older woman named Margaret approaches Thomas with a bowl of warm broth and wordlessly sits beside him. She doesn't try to talk him into joining the gathering. She doesn't offer false cheer or empty platitudes. She just sits her presence declaring, "You're not alone, even in your darkness." This is what medieval compassion often looked like, not dramatic intervention, but quiet persistence, the refusal to let someone vanish completely into their own isolation. The evening wears on. The rushlight near the kitchen passage burns down and is replaced with careful ceremony, snuffing the old rush, lighting the new one from the embers in the hearth, carrying it back to its position with cupped hands to protect the flame. Each rushlight represents hours of labor rendered animal fat harvested plants. Its burning is an investment in collective survival, and everyone treats it accordingly. By 10 at night, the storytelling is winding down. William has reached the end of his tale. The English army, having survived the winter siege, celebrates Easter with a feast of whatever they could forage or hunt. It's not a triumphant ending, but it's an ending that promises continuation, which is all anyone asks from a winter's tale. People begin settling into their sleeping positions, the same ritual you witnessed this morning in reverse. Pallets are unrolled blankets distributed according to rank and need. The central fire is dampened but not extinguished. One person is designated night watch, a rotating duty that ensures someone is always awake, always tending the fire, always alert for disaster. But before sleep, there's one final ritual prayer. Not the formal Latin prayers of church, but something older, simpler. A prayer to make it through the night, to wake up when dawn comes to see spring again. These prayers aren't addressed to a distant God sitting in judgment, but to something closer, more immediate to the castle itself, perhaps, or to the collective will of the people gathered here, or to whatever force in the universe grants humans the resilience to endure what shouldn't be endurable. The darkness deepens. The foxfire glows in distant passages, and somehow in that darkness, in that glow, in that patient waiting, another night of winter passes. The castle holds. The darkness doesn't win. And tomorrow, when weak light filters through again, people will rise and continue the task of surviving, breath by breath, hour by hour, until winter finally loses its grip and spring returns. Let me tell you about mirrors in winter, because they tell a larger story about medieval ingenuity, about working with scarcity, about transforming weakness into strength through observation and patience. In the 1430s, glass mirrors don't exist. Not in England, not in any form these castle dwellers would recognize. Venetian glassmakers are experimenting with tin mercury amalgam backing, but those early attempts produce images so distorted and darkened they're barely useful. The mirrors that exist in this castle, like mirrors throughout medieval Europe, are metal polished bronze, polished steel, occasionally polished silver for the wealthiest households. These mirrors don't reflect the way modern mirrors do. They capture perhaps 30% of the light that hits them, absorbing or scattering the rest. Place one in full sunlight and you'll see your face clearly enough. Place one in the dim interior of a winter castle and it becomes something else entirely. Not a tool for vanity, but a tool for survival. Watch what happens in the Great Hall on a rare, clear morning when sunlight manages to penetrate the narrow south-facing windows. That light, already weak from travelling through thick glass, already filtered by winter's low solar angle, enters the hall as a precious resource. In modern buildings, we'd waste it, let it splash on floors and walls without thinking. In this castle, every photon matters. Positioned in the window embrasures are metal mirrors, some flat, some slightly concave, held in articulated frames that allow careful adjustment of angle. A servant, whose entire winter duty revolves around these mirrors, adjusts them throughout the day, tracking the sun's arc across the southern sky, capturing its light and redirecting it deeper into the hall than it could naturally reach. This isn't simple reflection. This is geometry in service of survival. The mirrors redirect light to specific locations onto the raised platform where the Lord and his family sit, providing enough illumination to read documents or conduct administrative business. Onto work tables where women do intricate needlework that would be impossible by candlelight. Onto the area near the hearth where the steward keeps the castle's accounts, thin parchment ledgers that record every transaction in Latin abbreviations no more than 12 people in this building can read. But the mirrors do something more subtle, more profound, that takes years of living in winter darkness to fully appreciate. They provide psychological relief from the cave-like quality of interior space. Direct sunlight, even filtered and redirected, carries different information than firelight. It has a color temperature, bluish-white versus orange, that signals to the human nervous system daytime safety warmth. When that reflected light plays across stone walls, creating shifting patterns as clouds pass outside, it maintains people's connection to the external world, prevents the complete dissociation that happens when you spend weeks in artificial light only. Medieval texts don't discuss this explicitly. They couldn't. The vocabulary for describing light in psychological terms didn't exist yet. But the practice reveals the understanding mirrors are positioned not just for maximum illumination, but for maximum psychological benefit. The Lord's platform gets reflected light, not because the Lord is more important, though he is, but because he needs to remain mentally sharp for decision-making that affects the entire household. Poor decisions in winter can kill people. Let's move deeper into how medieval people actually understood light and its manipulation. The proto-scientific thinking of the time derived ultimately from Islamic scholars like Al-Hasan, who wrote about optics centuries earlier, held that light traveled in straight lines and could be redirected by smooth surfaces. This knowledge existed primarily in monastery libraries and university centers, not in the practical knowledge of castle servants. Yet, somehow, the practical knowledge and the theoretical knowledge aligned. The servants who positioned these mirrors understood intuitively what Al-Hasan proved mathematically: angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. They called it bouncing the sun, and children in the castle learned to do it with their own small polished metal discs, creating games that were simultaneously play and training. By the time you were 10 years old and raised in a castle, you understood how to capture light and send it where it was needed. This wasn't written in any manual. It was learned by doing, by watching, by the casual transmission of knowledge that characterized medieval education for everyone except the tiny literate elite. But mirrors weren't the only method of managing precious winter light. Let's look at the windows themselves, because they're more sophisticated than they appear. The windows in this great hall are small by modern standards. Vertical slits, perhaps 3 feet tall and 8 inches wide at their narrowest point. They were designed this way for defense arrow loops, technically, through which archers could shoot while remaining protected. But notice how the interior side of these windows splays outward, dramatically creating an embrasure that's nearly 6 feet wide where it meets the interior wall. This splaying serves multiple purposes. Militarily, it gives archers room to maneuver. Thermally, it reduces the cooling effect of the small exterior opening on the large interior space. The cold radiating from the glass affects a smaller volume of air. But optically, it creates a funnel for light, capturing the small beam entering through the exterior opening and spreading it across a much larger area inside. The effect is that these tiny windows, which should barely illuminate anything, actually cast light across surprisingly large sections of wall and floor. It's an architectural version of the same principle the metal mirrors use. Don't fight scarcity, redirect it, amplify it, make it work harder through clever geometry. And then there's the glass itself, which deserves attention because medieval glass was radically different from modern glass. It wasn't clear. It was greenish, full of bubbles, uneven in thickness, and often had a rippled surface from the manufacturing process. By modern standards, it's terrible, blocking or distorting perhaps 40% of incoming light. But in a castle window, it was revolutionary, because before glass became affordable in the 14th century, windows were either open holes, sealed with shutters in winter, which made interiors cave dark, or covered with oiled cloth, or horns scraped thin enough to be translucent, which admitted almost no light at all. Glass allowed light and thermal barrier simultaneously. Not perfectly, the panes were small, and the lead caming between them conducted cold inward, but well enough to change the equation of winter habitability. You could have illuminated interior space during the day without freezing everyone inside. This seems like a small thing, until you've experienced the alternative: choose light or choose warmth. But you can't have both. The wealthy installed glass. The poor continued with shutters and darkness, and the mortality difference was significant. A study of skeletal remains from the 14th and 15th centuries shows that individuals from wealthy households, identifiable by dental work and burial location, had fewer signs of vitamin D deficiency, stronger bones, healthier teeth, suggesting they received more sunlight exposure even in winter, likely by living in glass-windowed spaces where they could sit near light without sitting in drafts. This is what inequality looked like in medieval winters. Not just who ate more, but who could afford the architectural modifications that made survival more likely. Glass wasn't a luxury, it was a life extension technology. But let's return to those mirrors, because there's one more use for them that reveals the deep, practical mysticism that characterized medieval technology. On the darkest days when clouds seal the sky completely and the hall interior becomes tomb-like, the metal mirrors are repositioned to reflect firelight instead of sunlight. This seems counterintuitive. Firelight is already scarce. Why not let it shine directly? But the mirrors do something clever. They multiply the psychological impact without consuming extra fuel. When firelight reflects off mirrors, it creates the impression of multiple light sources. Your peripheral vision registers glints and glimmers from different directions, and your brain interprets this as a brighter environment than one central fire would create. It's not actually brighter in measurable terms, but it feels brighter, which is what matters for morale. Medieval people understood without neuroscience that human perception isn't objective. It's susceptible to manipulation, to the creation of impressions that diverge from physical reality. They used this understanding ruthlessly. Mirrors positioned to multiply firelight tapestries, arranged to make small spaces feel larger. Strategic use of scent herbs in the rushes to mask the smells of unwashed bodies and old smoke. These weren't deceptions meant to mislead. They were survival technologies meant to make an intolerable situation tolerable, to trick the mind into accepting conditions the body couldn't change. Let me give you one final example of medieval light manipulation that demonstrates how sophisticated this understanding became. The use of polished metal plates to create what they called light wells. In some of the interior chambers rooms that had no external windows at all, metal plates were installed in the ceiling and positioned to capture light from high windows in adjacent spaces. These plates, usually copper or bronze, depending on what the castle could afford, reflected light downward into otherwise dark rooms. The installation required understanding three-dimensional geometry. You needed to know the angle of incoming light, the position of the reflective surface, and the location of the target area. Get any of these wrong, and the light well would illuminate nothing useful. Get them right, and you could bring daylight 2 rooms away from its source, allowing work or habitation in spaces that would otherwise be useless in winter. These light wells were rare. They required considerable metalwork and expertise, but wherever they existed, they were maintained with religious devotion. Because they represented something profound, the ability to push light into darkness through human cleverness, to extend the reach of day into the realm of night, to assert some small measure of control over winter's dominion. When you stand in one of these interior rooms on a winter afternoon, watching the patch of reflected sunlight move slowly across the floor as the sun tracks west, you understand something about medieval resilience. They didn't accept darkness as inevitable. They fought it with whatever tools they could create, and they passed that knowledge down through generations, improving it incrementally, creating systems of such elegance that even now, 6 centuries later, they command respect. The mirrors are more than mirrors. They're declarations of intent, their refusals to surrender. They're proof that humans, even humans, living in conditions of extreme resource scarcity, can still create beauty and utility from reflected light and polished metal. As the sun sets outside and the mirrors lose their primary function, they're carefully covered with cloth to prevent overnight condensation from dulling their surfaces. Tomorrow, if the sun appears, they'll be uncovered and adjusted again, continuing their work of gathering scarce light and distributing it where it's needed most. This is the daily practice of medieval's innovation, small actions repeated, endlessly refined across lifetimes, creating systems that keep people alive not through dramatic intervention, but through patient attention to detail. The castle holds. The light, however meager, persists. And in that persistence is the story of human survival, not through dominance or abundance, but through careful management of scarcity, through respect for every photon and every calorie and every breath of warmth. Tomorrow we'll explore other mysteries. But tonight, as darkness returns, the mirrors rest beneath their cloth coverings, waiting for another dawn. There are secrets in these walls that don't appear in any chronicle, any administrative record, any letter preserved in archives. They're secrets of the body of breath of the intimate knowledge that means the difference between waking and not waking. Let me show you what I mean. Look carefully at the door we passed through earlier. Not the grand entrance, but one of the interior doors leading to sleeping chambers. If you examine it in bright light, you'll notice something odd. A keyhole far larger than necessary. Perhaps an inch in diameter when a quarter inch would suffice for the mechanism. And not just in the door handle area, but additional holes drilled through the door at different heights, chest level, knee level, small circular openings that serve no obvious structural purpose. These aren't defects. They're life support systems. In winter, when chambers are sealed against cold and fires are banked low to conserve fuel, the air inside small rooms can become dangerously oxygen depleted. Carbon dioxide from breathing carbon monoxide from incompletely burned firewood, the general staleness of unrefreshed air. These create what medieval people called foul vapors, a condition they couldn't chemically analyze but absolutely recognized through its effects. Headaches, nausea, eventual unconsciousness, sometimes death. The keyholes and small drill holes aren't just for ventilation. Any crack would provide that. They're sized and positioned with specific intention, large enough to allow meaningful air exchange, small enough not to create drafts that would kill sleeping people through cold exposure. The positioning at different heights creates a convection cycle. Cold, fresh air enters through the lower holes. Warm, stale air exits through the upper ones, driven by density differences without requiring any mechanical system. This knowledge came at a cost. We know from coroner's inquests, the few that survive, that in the hardest winters, families were sometimes found dead in their chambers. Doors sealed too tightly against the cold fireplaces, consuming what little oxygen remained. Each tragedy taught a lesson. Not, don't seal the room. They'd freeze, but seal it almost completely, but leave these small openings. The specific sizes and positions of the holes varied from castle to castle, refined through trial and error, through observation of what worked and what killed. There was no central authority publishing specifications. This was distributed experimentation across medieval Europe, with each household learning independently, and knowledge spreading only through travel intermarriage, the movement of skilled servants between estates. What we're looking at is evolutionary engineering, random variation, different sizes and positions of holes, combined with selection pressure configurations that killed people weren't repeated, producing optimization over generations. The surviving castles, the ones that kept their inhabitants alive through enough winters to be worth maintaining, all converged on similar solutions. Doors with holes windows, with specific sizes of gaps, ventilation shafts with particular cross-sections. The castle taught its builders through death and survival. The builders learned. The castle remembers the lessons in its physical form. Now let's talk about clothing as architecture, as the final, most intimate layer of protection between your body and the cold. Modern people wear layers. Yes, but we don't understand layers the way medieval people did. We think of layers as additive if you're cold. Put on another sweater. Medieval layering was strategic, functional, calibrated to specific activities and conditions. Start with the foundation, the linen chemise or braise undergarments worn directly against skin. Linen seems like a strange choice for winter. It's not particularly warm, but it serves a crucial function. Wicking. Your body produces moisture constantly through perspiration, and in winter, that moisture is your enemy. If it's absorbed by wool, the primary insulating layer, the wool's effectiveness drops dramatically. Wet wool loses about 70% of its insulating capacity. The linen layer keeps your body's moisture away from the wool, allowing it to be expelled into the air rather than retained against your skin. Next comes the wool layers. Not just one, but typically 3 or 4 separate garments for anyone spending time in barely heated spaces. But notice the construction: each wool layer is slightly looser than the one beneath it, creating air gaps. These gaps are the actual insulation. Wool is just the structure that holds the air still. Still air is one of the best insulators available. It has a thermal conductivity of about 0.0024 Wn/K, comparable to modern foam insulators. The medieval people who designed these garments didn't know the numbers, but they understood the principle: trap air in thin layers distributed across your body. One thick wool garment is far less effective than 4 thin ones with air gaps between them. And then the outer layer for wealthy households: fur. But not just any fur applied in any way. Let me explain the sophistication here, because it's remarkable. Different furs have different properties. Rabbit fur is lightweight and reasonably warm, but compacts easily, losing its loft. Squirrel fur is denser, maintains its structure better, but is expensive. Fox and beaver fur contain oils that make them water-resistant, crucial for outdoor work in snow or freezing rain. Ermine, the white winter fur of stoats, was reserved for royalty, not just because of rarity, but because of performance. It's both warm and remarkably lightweight, doesn't compress. And the white color has a high albedo, reflects rather than absorbs solar radiation, preventing overheating if you're active in sunlight. The way fur was applied to garments matters too. The common method was fur-lining fur sewn to the inside of outer cloaks or surcoats, with the fur facing inward against the body. This seems intuitive, but isn't optimal. Better was the practice of split lining: 2 thin layers of fur, one with fur facing inward, one with fur facing outward, sandwiching a layer of wool. This created multiple air-trapping interfaces and prevented both inner moisture transfer and outer cold penetration. Wealthy households understood these distinctions. Poor households wore whatever fur they could trap, hunt, or afford, usually rabbit or sheepskin, with the wool left on, which was inferior but better than nothing. Now here's where this becomes an anthropological mystery. How did this knowledge develop and spread? Fur garment construction is complex. The patterns must account for body movement. The seams must be positioned to avoid creating cold spots. The types of fur must be matched to specific body zones. Warmer fur on torso, lighter fur on limbs to avoid restricting movement. This isn't knowledge you develop alone in a single lifetime. This is accumulated expertise requiring generations of experimentation and knowledge transfer. But medieval people were largely illiterate. Technical knowledge wasn't written in manuals. It was demonstrated, taught hand to hand, from master furriers to apprentices, from mothers to daughters sewing household garments. The fact that sophisticated fur garment designs converged across medieval Europe, similar patterns found in England, France, Scandinavia, Russia suggests either common ancestry, possibly reaching back to Ice Age hunter-gatherer cultures, or parallel development constrained by the physics of insulation and the mechanics of the human body. Either way, what we're looking at is a technology older than writing, older than agriculture, older than the castles themselves. The castle is new. The knowledge of how to wrap your body in dead animal skins to survive cold is ancient, passed forward through 10,000 years, refined continuously landing in these medieval garments with their multiple furs and precise construction. When you see a medieval noble in a winter portrait, dressed in ermine-trimmed robes, you're not just seeing wealth displayed. You're seeing survival technology functioning at its highest refinement. The culmination of a design process that started when humans first moved into northern climates and had to learn generation by generation through uncounted deaths from exposure exactly how to dress to stay alive. Let's go deeper still into the mystery of sleep itself. Let's look at the mystery of sleep itself. In medieval times, sleep wasn't the solid 8-hour block we strive for today. It was segmented, divided into 2 distinct phases, with a waking period in between. This wasn't just biology. It was a winter survival skill born of necessity. The central fire required tending in the middle of the night to ensure it didn't die out. And in that waking hour, the castle breathed, checked its warmth, and settled back down. But the most critical adaptation was shared sleeping. Modern privacy would have been a death sentence here. In the bitter cold, 5 people sleeping in a cluster generate a collective heat envelope that keeps everyone alive. Medieval beds were massive platforms designed for this very purpose. It wasn't about overcrowding, it was thermal engineering. By sleeping together, they created a microclimate of body heat, a mammalian instinct that recognized a simple truth often missed in a standard medieval documentary: isolation kills, but proximity saves. The castle teaches this lesson over and over: you survive together, or you don't survive at all. There is no individual salvation in a medieval winter. There is only the collective endurance of people who understand that warmth is something you create between bodies, not something you hoard for yourself. Morning will come. But for now, in the deep night, the mysteries of breath and warmth and shared human presence keep death at bay, one sleeping hour at a time. There's a song being sung in the Great Hall tonight, and it's worth understanding why. The melody is older than this castle, older than the Norman conquest, probably older than Christianity in England. The words have changed over centuries, adapted from Celtic to Saxon, to Norman French, to Middle English. But the tune remains, carrying some pre-literate memory of winter survival into this present moment. It's not a war song or a sacred hymn. It's something simpler, a work chant, the kind that was sung in fields during harvest, to keep people moving in rhythm, to make exhausting labor bearable through collective sound. But in winter, when no work is being done, the song serves a different function. 30 people are singing it, now gathered near the central hearth. They're not performing for an audience. Everyone in the hall is either singing or listening. And as they sing, something measurable happens. Their breathing synchronizes. This isn't mystical, it's biomechanical. Singing requires coordinated inhalation and exhalation. When a group sings together, they necessarily breathe together, And synchronized breathing creates synchronized heart rates through a mechanism called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. Heart rates align across the group, creating a physiological state of coherence that feels subjectively like deep connection. Your body temperature rises slightly during this coherence. Not much, perhaps half a degree Celsius, but multiply that by 30 people in close proximity, and the collective thermal output increases measurably. The air around the singing group becomes demonstrably warmer than the ambient hall temperature. People near the singers feel this warmth and move closer, not consciously seeking heat, but drawn by the subtle comfort it provides. This is what I mean by collective warmth, not just the physical heat of bodies in proximity, but the total package of physical and psychological effects that emerge when humans synchronize their behavior in winter survival situations. Medieval people didn't understand the cardiovascular system or thermoregulation. They couldn't have explained why singing together feels warming. But they knew that it does, and they built this knowledge into winter survival practice through songs, chants, and coordinated activities designed specifically to generate collective physiological states. Let me show you another example, more subtle but equally important: the evening meal. In wealthy modern homes, people eat individually or in small family groups at their own pace, according to personal preference. In this great hall, everyone eats together, not at the same instant, but in overlapping waves that create continuous social presence. The meal tonight is modest barley porridge with bits of salted pork, dark bread, weak ale. Not much by any standard, certainly not enough to feel full. But watch how it's consumed. People eat slowly, deliberately, with frequent pauses for conversation. A single bowl of porridge that could be consumed in 3 minutes is stretched to 20. This isn't just manners or ceremony, it's thermal strategy. Digestion generates heat, the thermic effect of food, about 10% of the calories consumed. But that heat doesn't appear instantly. It builds gradually as your digestive system processes the meal. By eating slowly, people extend the warming period, creating a gentle rise in core body temperature that persists for hours after the meal ends. By eating collectively at overlapping times, they ensure that at any given moment during the evening, some portion of the hall's population is digesting and therefore generating slightly elevated body heat. The hall never cools to its potential minimum because the collective metabolic activity, breathing, digesting, moving, singing, continuously adds small increments of heat to the environment. It's not enough to create comfort, but it's enough to create survival. Now watch what happens after the meal games. Not elaborate games requiring equipment or special knowledge, but simple activities that generate movement and laughter. Tonight, a group of children and young adults is playing hot cockles. One person kneels blindfolded, while others take turns slapping their back, and the kneeling person tries to guess who did it. It's ridiculous, childish, undignified by modern standards. It's also thermally essential. The physical activity, kneeling, standing, the quick movements of slapping, elevates heart rate and body temperature. The laughter, and there's lots of laughter, genuine mirth at the guesses and misguesses, forces deep breathing, increases circulation, creates endorphin release that makes cold more tolerable. Medieval physicians would have explained this through the theory of humours. Games warm the blood and dispel melancholic vapours. Modern physiology would explain it through increased metabolic activity and neurotransmitter release. Both explanations arrive at the same practical conclusion. People who play games in winter survive better than people who sit still and wait for spring. This is why winter in a castle wasn't just endured passively. It was actively resisted through social technologies. Games, songs, shared meals, storytelling that transformed individual metabolisms into a collective survival system. This is why winter in a castle wasn't just endured passively. It was actively resisted through social technologies, games, songs, shared meals that transformed individual metabolisms into a collective survival system. This collective existence extended into the night. While we might view the lack of personal space as a hardship, in the context of a medieval winter, it was a lifeline. As the evening games wind down and the fire is banked, the hall reorganizes itself instinctively. The most vulnerable, the elderly and the young, are positioned in the center, shielded by the healthier adults on the perimeter. It is a harsh reality of medieval life, but also a deeply human one. They aren't just huddling, they are building a living battery of warmth. This is the ultimate winter survival skill, the recognition that warmth is a shared resource. As the great hall settles into silence, 50 people breathing in rhythm create a stable thermal pocket in the freezing stone. They hold the cold at bay, not with technology, but with presence. This is the secret the castle has always known. Humans aren't meant to survive winter alone. In the realities of medieval times, you survive pressed close breathing, shared air, trusting that the warmth you give will be returned when you need it most. The great hall settles into sleep. The collective temperature stabilizes. And outside, winter continues its patient siege. But for now, for tonight, the castle holds. The people hold each other. And that, in the end, is enough. 3 a.m, the hour when bodies are weakest, heat is lowest, and winter claims those it can. The great hall barely stirs. Breath rises and falls. The fire is no longer flame, only memory embers still leaking the faintest warmth into the dark. Come with me down, past sleeping forms, down the spiral stair, past storage, past cellar, to the lowest point of the castle where stone meets bedrock and architecture gives way to earth. No light reaches here. No one comes unless they must. This is the castle's root system. Feel the air, warmer than anywhere above. Earth heat, slow and patient, gathered here after months of travel through clay and stone. Summer arriving late. The walls are raw rock. In places, the builders didn't build at all. They carved the cliff and made it part of the castle. Human work and geology blur. The castle doesn't sit on the earth. It grows from it. Touch the stone. Their subtle vibration, not machinery. The planet itself moving beneath you. Indifferent, endless. The castle borrows that patience. It takes the earth's slow warmth and feeds it upward. It traps breath-body heat motion, stretching fragile human warmth across the night. Fast life survives by leaning on slow time. Now we climb. 13 degrees here, 12 above, 11, 10. A shallow gradient, but everything. More than fire, more than clothing. This slope of heat is what keeps people alive, only if the system holds. Vents must stay clear, doors closed, bodies present. The castle lives only if humans tend it. Back in the hall, look up. The ceiling is lost in darkness, but it matters. Warm air rises and gathers there, forming a buffer. Without that height, cold would crush the sleepers below. The vault isn't vanity, it's survival. The builders didn't know equations. They knew winters. Knowledge lived in hands, not books. Dawn is still distant, but change has begun. A fire is coaxed back to life. Ovens warm. Heat spreads in small ripples. For now, the castle is pure physics. Earth rising, cold falling stone. Mediating air moving by laws older than language. This is what the castle truly is, not power, not defense, but a climate engine made of rock and breath tuned just enough to keep mammals alive. The sleepers don't know this. They only know they lived through another night. Outside, winter rages. Inside, life persists. The system holds. Dawn comes, and the castle continues silent, patient breathing until spring finally loosens winter's grip and survival becomes something less urgent than this quiet, hourly negotiation with death. We've been together for nearly 2.5 hours now, traveling through the layers of a medieval castle. Winter understanding not just the stones and fires, but the deeper rhythms of survival, the breathing of earth through limestone, the circulation of warmth through collective human presence, the silent negotiation between cold and the systems built to resist it. What have we really learned? Not the romantic mythology of medieval life, not the sanitized versions that appear in movies and novels. We've learned that survival in the 1430s was a technical achievement, a daily practice of observation and adjustment, a collaboration between human ingenuity and the physical properties of stone, air, earth, and water. The castle wasn't just a building. It was an organism breathing through its ventilation shafts, drinking from condensation wells, warming itself from below through geological heat, insulating itself with trapped air and human presence. And the people who lived within its walls weren't passive inhabitants. They were participants in a system that required constant attention, constant maintenance, constant collective effort. The real medieval survival skill, the one we've lost and might need to relearn as climate change makes our modern systems less reliable, is this the ability to read buildings, to understand thermal systems without instruments to work with natural processes, rather than overwhelming them with energy-intensive technology. Those medieval castellans, checking walls for condensation, testing airflows, by field positioning people to maximize collective heat, they knew things we've forgotten. Not because they were smarter, but because they couldn't afford to be ignorant. When your survival depends on managing microclimates in stone buildings heated only by fire and body warmth, you learn. You pay attention. You pass knowledge to the next generation through demonstration and practice. And here's the profound thing: they succeeded. For centuries, through the coldest period Europe had experienced since the last ice age, communities survived in these stone structures. Not comfortably, not without loss, but they endured. The castles kept them alive long enough to see spring, to plant crops, to raise children who would face their own winters. This knowledge lives in the stones themselves now. You can visit surviving medieval castles and see it: the ventilation shafts, the thick walls, the deep cellars, the high ceilings of great halls. These features weren't accidents or aesthetic choices. They were survival technologies refined through generations of trial and error, preserved in the physical form of buildings that have outlasted the empires that built them. What does this mean for us, for you listening in the relative comfort of the 21st century? Maybe it's a reminder that human resilience is deeper than we think, that our ancestors survived conditions we'd consider impossible, that the same ingenuity that kept people alive through medieval winters still exists in us, waiting to be accessed if we need it. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just the recognition that warmth, real warmth, the kind that sustains life through dark months, isn't just about technology or resources. It's about presence, about collective effort, about the willingness to share what little heat we have with those around us. The castle taught this lesson every winter you survive together, or you don't survive. Individual salvation isn't possible when the cold is deep enough. Only the collective endures. As we close this journey, I want you to think about your own life, your own winters, not just the seasonal ones, but the metaphorical dark periods we all pass through. What are your stones, your deep cellars, your sources of earth heat? What are the systems, the relationships, the practices that keep you alive when conditions become harsh? And perhaps more importantly, who are you sharing warmth with? Who is in your great hall breathing the same air, contributing to the collective survival? Because the medieval castle's final lesson is this: we're not meant to endure alone. We're meant to huddle together, to share breath and warmth, to create microclimates of survival through proximity and care. If you've found value in tonight's journey, if these voices from the past have spoken to something in your present, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel. We create these historical explorations, these windows into how humans survived, adapted, and persevered through conditions that tested the limits of endurance, because we believe the past has wisdom for the present. Not romantic wisdom, not simplified lessons, but the hard-won knowledge of people who faced real challenges and found real solutions. And the castle, that patient stone organism, would whisper this if it could speak: don't wait for perfect conditions. Don't demand comfort before you begin living. Work with what you have: stone, earth, air, the warmth of bodies near yours, and create the microclimate you need, degree by degree, breath by breath, day by day. Winter always ends, but only for those who survive long enough to see spring. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Thank you for listening to these stories of stone and survival of cold, and the human warmth that resists it. I hope you found some comfort here, some companionship in the dark hours, some reminder that you're part of a long line of humans who faced their own winters and endured. Now let yourself rest. Let the castle hold you as it held those medieval souls 6 centuries ago. Let your breathing slow your body, relax your mind, release the day's tensions. You're safe here in this space we've created together, protected by knowledge and stone, and the quiet confidence that comes from understanding how survival really works. The castle breathes, you breathe, and in that shared rhythm, winter becomes survivable darkness, becomes navigable, and another night passes into morning. Sleep well, dream of spring, and know that when you wake, you'll carry with you something from this journey, some fragment of medieval resilience, some echo of the wisdom that kept humans alive through the coldest centuries. Until next time, this is Peter Miller. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey through history. The castle holds, the earth warms, and life patient and persistent continues. Good night.